You weren't taught to think. You were trained to repeat. And the better you repeated, the more they smiled. You followed the rules, recited the right answers, and they told you you're smart. But deep down you started to wonder, was this really intelligence or just compliance in disguise? No one ever praised you for asking a question they couldn't answer. No one celebrated your curiosity when it made them uncomfortable. In fact, the moment your questions stepped outside the boundaries of the textbook, you weren't seen as gifted. You were seen as disruptive. They didn't reward wonder. They rewarded obedience. Obedience disguised as excellence. You got the grades, the certificates, the gold stars, not because you thought differently, but because you learned when to stay quiet and when to echo what they wanted to hear. And slowly, without realizing it, you began to equate approval with silence and intelligence with memorization. This is the quiet betrayal of modern education. It doesn't shape thinkers, it filters for followers. Not the most brilliant minds, but the most trainable ones. The system does not ask, who understands the world in a new way? It asks, who can absorb and regurgitate information the fastest? And those who can, those who adapt, conform, perform, they rise to the top. But not because they're the most insightful, because they are the most programmable. Education, as we know it, is not a ladder to liberation. It is a funnel. A system designed not to unlock potential, but to standardize it. And the tragedy is, most never question it. They go through years of training, thinking they are learning to think, when in reality they are learning to obey. Ask yourself, when was the last time you were rewarded for saying, I don't know? When was the last time you were encouraged to ask a question that had no clear answer? That's not how the system works. Because in that moment, when you begin to think freely, when you dare to challenge the script, you're not just inconvenient, you're dangerous. Because obedience was never a side effect, it was the goal. And it starts early. In classrooms where silence is praised more than insight, where children learn quickly that the fastest way to be smart is to stop asking why, where creativity is celebrated only when it stays within the lines, and conformity is disguised as maturity. The child who memorizes is labeled gifted. The child who questions is labeled difficult. And so we raise generations not to explore truth, but to fear it, not to seek meaning, but to avoid disruption. This is not an accident, it is design, because a system built on control cannot afford too many minds that wander. It needs predictability, compliance, quiet brilliance that knows when to speak and when to shut down. That's the unspoken lesson. Intelligence is welcome, so long as it doesn't challenge the curriculum, the grading scale, the comfort of authority. And what's left behind is a kind of intellectual ghost. You learn how to pass tests, but forget how to think. You learn how to impress others, but lose touch with your own questions. And slowly, your curiosity, the most vital part of your mind, doesn't die. It adapts. It hides. It waits for a safer place to breathe. But the truth is, safety rarely comes, because the world outside rewards the same patterns. Follow orders. Say what's expected. Think, but not too much. And if you do think quietly. Don't disrupt. Don't provoke. Don't shine too bright. Because if you do, you'll remind others of everything they've sacrificed for approval. This is how brilliance is buried. Not with hate, but with applause. The system doesn't have to crush your spirit to control you. It only needs to train you to doubt it, to mistrust your own inner voice, to question yourself before you ever question the system. That's how control survives, disguised as education, protected by praise. But what if the real measure of intelligence isn't how well you repeat, but how bravely you question? What if your discomfort wasn't failure, but your mind waking up? And what if the reward for obedience has always been the quiet punishment of losing yourself? You didn't stop asking why because you stopped caring. You stopped because you realized it made people uncomfortable. You learned, not through punishment, but through subtle rejection, that too many questions make you a problem. You saw how teachers smiled less when you strayed from the curriculum, how classmates rolled their eyes when you raised your hand too often, how adults shifted in their seats when your questions dug beneath the surface, and slowly, question by question, your curiosity wasn't killed. It was trained into silence, because in the classroom, children who ask too much aren't called engaged. They're called disruptive. Stay on topic, they say. Let's move on. That's not relevant right now. What they really mean is, don't dig too deep. And so, you learn to hold it in. Not because you've lost your sense of wonder, but because survival demands it. You stop chasing understanding and start chasing approval. You don't grow out of curiosity, you bury it. And the data backs this quiet tragedy. A 2021 OECD study found that only 15% of American teachers regularly encourage open-ended questions in class. In other words, the majority of classrooms reward right answers, not deeper inquiry. A Harvard Graduate School of Education report in 2020 revealed something even more alarming. Student curiosity consistently declines from first grade to 12th. The longer a child stays in school, the less curious they become. Not because they grow dull, but because they're taught to suppress their questions. And Gallup's 2022 poll confirms what so many students feel but can't say out loud. 65% of American high schoolers report feeling bored by school. Not challenged, not inspired, bored. And yet, we pretend this is normal. We act like it's a natural part of growing up, like the fading of curiosity is inevitable. But what if it's not? What if it's not that children stop wondering, but that their wonder is punished until it goes quiet? What if curiosity isn't failing? What if the system is? Because real curiosity doesn't just seek answers, it challenges assumptions. It pokes holes in narratives, it asks uncomfortable questions, it exposes what we'd rather ignore, and that makes it dangerous in a system designed to maintain order. In that system, a curious mind isn't a gift, it's a liability, something to be managed, redirected, silenced. So the child learns. They learn that silence brings rewards and curiosity brings resistance. They learn to sit still when their minds are racing, to pretend they're engaged when they're actually confused, to nod along with ideas they haven't had the space to question, and they carry this skill into adulthood, this learned performance of compliance. A mask worn so long it starts to feel like a face, but somewhere inside, the questions never stopped. They just lost their voice. And every once in a while, when the world goes quiet and the pressure to conform fades for just a moment, you hear them again, that whisper inside asking, why? Not to challenge, not to rebel, just to understand, to feel alive. This is the quiet grief of growing up curious in a world that fears curiosity. You didn't lose your wonder, you just stopped showing it. You learned that it's safer to mimic than to explore, easier to agree than to question. And so, your brilliance adapted. It went underground. But just because curiosity goes silent doesn't mean it's gone. It waits for someone, somewhere, to say it's okay to ask again. To say that thinking differently isn't a threat, it's a gift. And maybe that starts with you. Because if we're brave enough to ask the questions again, we might rediscover the voice we were never supposed to lose. The one that dared to wonder even when the world told us to sit down and be quiet. You learn early that asking questions makes people uncomfortable. But what you don't realize until much later is that the system isn't just uncomfortable with your curiosity. It's afraid of it, because true curiosity doesn't stop at facts. It asks deeper questions, foundational ones, the kind that shake the ground we've been taught to stand on. And that's the moment you become dangerous. Not when you question a lesson, but when you question the system that wrote it. Erich Fromm understood this fear, long before it had a name. In Escape from Freedom, he wrote, "Modern man thinks he's free because he chooses between brands, but he's afraid of choosing ideas." He saw the illusion we live in, a world where we're encouraged to consume endlessly, but discouraged from thinking independently. A world where the freedom to choose between products is mistaken for the freedom to choose how to live. Fromm didn't see modern education as a path to liberation. He saw it as a machine, efficient, polite, and deeply afraid of disruption. Because the truth is, the system doesn't want thinkers, it wants consumers. People who follow the rules, not question who wrote them. People who believe they're free because they can choose between option A and option B, without ever asking who created the options. That's why real curiosity is treated like a threat, because it doesn't just ask, "What is this?" It asks, "Why is this the way it is? Who benefits from this structure? What if there's a better way?" And those kinds of questions make people nervous, especially the ones in charge. Fromm believed that modern education doesn't produce people who know how to think. It produces people who know how to obey, to perform, to fit into a world that already exists, instead of imagining one that could be different. And that's not education, that's indoctrination. That's conditioning wrapped in polite language and standardized tests. He argued that most people don't actually want freedom, not the real kind, because real freedom requires responsibility. It demands courage. It forces you to step away from the crowd and say, "I will decide for myself." But that's terrifying. So instead, most of us choose structure. We choose authority. We choose the comfort of someone else's answers. And in the classroom, that pattern is reinforced from day one. Don't ask, "Why are we learning this?" Just learn it. Don't ask, "Who decided this matters?" Just study it. And whatever you do, don't ask, "Who made the rules?" Because that's the most dangerous question of all. Because once a student starts asking who wrote the rules, they're not just learning anymore, they're awakening. They're breaking out of the role of passive recipient and stepping into the role of independent mind. And nothing threatens a rigid system more than a mind that thinks for itself. Fromm called this the great paradox of freedom, that people fear it even as they long for it. And so they trade their autonomy for security, their curiosity for conformity, their inner voice for external validation. And schools, knowingly or not, become factories for this trade. Places where the goal isn't to unlock minds, but to tame them. But what if education could be something else? What if it didn't fear independent minds, but nurtured them? What if the child who asked, "Who made these rules?" wasn't punished, but celebrated? Because in a world that punishes curiosity, independence becomes rebellion. But in truth, it's not rebellion, it's awakening. And maybe the real purpose of education isn't to produce perfect answers, but to protect the questions that make us free. By the time you've learned not to ask who wrote the rules, something deeper has already shifted. You've stopped being curious, not because you lost interest, but because you learned it's safer to be quiet. And that silence doesn't just affect your thoughts, it changes your sense of self. Because when your questions are ignored, when your wonder is dismissed, when your real voice is met with discomfort, you begin to hide, not just from others, but from yourself. Carl Jung understood this silent transformation. He called it the birth of the persona, the social mask we wear to survive. "We all wear masks," he wrote, "but the tragedy is forgetting we're wearing one." In childhood, that mask starts small. You smile when you're praised for behaving. You shrink when you're scolded for being too much. You learn which emotions are acceptable, which thoughts are safe, which parts of you are too strange, too deep, too real for the world to welcome. And over time, the mask grows thicker. What was once a performance becomes your identity. You become the good student, the polite child, the successful adult. But inside, something feels off. You've done everything right. You followed the rules. You earned the grades. You smiled at the right times and played the role the system rewarded. And yet you feel hollow, disconnected, not from others, but from something inside. And you can't explain it, because no one ever told you that being good, in the eyes of the world, might come at the cost of your soul. Jung didn't see this as a minor side effect. He believed this disconnection from the true self, the self, was the root of many psychological crises, not just anxiety or creative blocks or burnout, but the deeper, quieter unraveling people often mistake for a career crisis or a midlife slump. He believed these were symptoms of something far more profound, the loss of authenticity. When children are rewarded for performance over truth, they don't just lose their creativity. They lose trust in their own inner voice. And without that voice, how do you know what you truly want? How do you know what you believe, feel, need? If all you've ever been taught is how to perform what's acceptable, you don't. So you look outside, you chase approval, validation, structure, anything to fill the quiet ache inside. But no matter how much you achieve, the emptiness lingers. Because the mask was never meant to be you, it was meant to protect you. But when it becomes permanent, when it becomes all anyone sees, you start to believe that's all you are. And when that happens, the parts of you that don't fit the mask begin to rot in the dark. The sensitive part, the curious part, the part that once asked, who wrote the rules, before it was told to sit down and behave. Those parts don't disappear, they just go silent. And that silence over time becomes depression, disorientation, a deep sense that something is missing, even when everything looks fine. Not because you're broken, but because you've been pretending for too long. Jung believed healing doesn't begin with more achievements or better habits or more applause. It begins when you notice the mask, when you realize that the version of yourself the world accepts is only a fraction of who you truly are. And it begins when you stop asking, how can I fit in? And start asking, who was I before I was told to be good? Because the truth is, your emptiness isn't failure, it's feedback. A message from your deeper self, one that's been waiting patiently for you to listen again. By the time you realize the mask doesn't fit, the damage has already begun. You don't just feel disconnected from others, you feel distant from yourself. You start to wonder if maybe you were never meant to belong in the first place. Maybe something's wrong with you. Maybe you think too much, ask too much, feel too much. But what if the problem was never you? What if your questions weren't too big, but the classroom was too small? It's a quiet truth, but a powerful one. Curiosity doesn't fail. The system does, again and again. Think of Albert Einstein. As a child, he was labeled slow. Teachers thought he struggled to learn. They missed the brilliance simmering beneath his silence, not because it wasn't there, but because it didn't fit their mold. Einstein later wrote, "It is a miracle that curiosity survives formal education." He didn't say that lightly, he meant it. Because to remain curious in a system that rewards repetition over reflection, obedience over originality, is nothing short of a rebellion. And it wasn't just Einstein. Steve Jobs dropped out of college, but he didn't stop learning. He wandered into a typography class, not because it would earn him a degree, but because something in him was still alive, still searching. That curiosity, ungraded, unapproved, unassigned, eventually shaped the visual design of every Apple device in the world. And when asked what mattered most, Jobs said, "Don't let the noise of others' opinions drown out your own inner voice." That voice, the one that kept whispering beneath all the lectures and rules and silence, that's what the system couldn't destroy. Because no matter how many tests you took, how many times you were told to stop overthinking, some part of you never gave in. It just waited for permission, waited for space, waited for someone to say, maybe you're not too much, maybe you're exactly enough. For a deeper world, the system forgot how to see. Because here's the truth. The people who change the world are rarely the ones who thrived within it. They're the ones the system ignored, or misunderstood, or pushed out, not because they were failures, but because their minds were too expansive, too unconventional, too alive to be caged by checkboxes. The question is not whether you were good enough for school. The question is whether school was deep enough for your mind. The problem isn't that your questions were unworthy. The problem is the system never expected you to ask them, because a system built on control has no space for minds that seek freedom. And make no mistake, that's what curiosity is. It's freedom. Freedom from assumptions, freedom from repetition, freedom to see the world not as it is, but as it could be. You were never too curious. You were just in a place that didn't know what to do with that kind of fire. But now you do, because the voices who shaped history, the scientists, the artists, the inventors, the thinkers, they all shared one thing in common. They kept asking, even when the world told them to stop. They followed the trail of their own wonder, even when it led them away from comfort, away from convention, away from what was expected. So if you ever felt like you didn't fit in, maybe you weren't supposed to. Maybe your mind wasn't built for conformity. Maybe it was built to imagine something better. And maybe, just maybe, the system didn't fail to shape you. You outgrew it before it even had the chance. By now, you may realize something heartbreaking, that the silence wasn't just something the system created. At some point, you started carrying it yourself. You stopped raising your hand, not because you had no questions, but because you knew the cost. You learned how to shrink your voice to fit into rooms that didn't want to hear it. You were praised for being quiet, for being easy, for making things simple. You were rewarded for holding your fire, and punished, however subtly, for letting it burn too bright. And maybe, over time, you believed that was the right thing to do. But here's the truth. The system won't stop punishing curiosity, not anytime soon. It's built on control, on predictability, on the comfort of sameness. But you can stop apologizing for your questions. You can stop acting like your wonder is a flaw. And even more importantly, you can stop passing that silence on to the people coming after you. Because if you ever learn to stay small just to feel safe, then you know better than anyone what that silence costs. The child who lowers their voice, the student who stops raising their hand, the young person who starts second-guessing their instincts, their insights, their fire, not because they're wrong, but because the world never made space for them to be right. Don't let them carry the silence you had to bear. Whether you're a teacher, a parent, a mentor, or simply someone who's walked the road of being misunderstood, you now hold something powerful, the chance to be what you never had. Not the person with all the answers, but the one who says, it's okay to ask. Instead of lecturing, try listening. Instead of testing for correctness, explore the question together. Instead of rewarding repetition, encourage real understanding. Because they don't need you to be perfect. They don't need you to be all-knowing. What they need, what they're aching for, is to see that it's possible to grow up and still stay curious. That you can survive the system without letting it strip your spark. That thinking deeply, feeling fully, asking honestly isn't something to outgrow, but something to protect. You are living proof that the system doesn't define your worth. That curiosity, though buried, never died. And if you've managed to carry even a flicker of that flame through the noise, through the masks, through the years of being told to tone it down, then you already know how powerful it is. Now imagine what could happen if someone younger saw that flame and felt permission to keep their own alive. That's how the silence ends. Not by tearing down the whole system overnight, but by refusing to reenact its harm. By choosing, in one conversation, one classroom, one moment of connection, to do it differently. To let a question hang in the air instead of rushing to answer it. To say, that's a good question, even when you don't know the answer. to create space, real space, for minds that don't want to repeat, but to rethink. Because curiosity doesn't need a perfect system to survive. It just needs a little light, a little air, and someone brave enough to stop pretending they never asked why. You might not change the system, but you can interrupt the silence. And sometimes that's enough to save a mind, maybe even your own.